Gauge is so important, everyone. So I really just want to make this little video as an aside to the previous video about preparing for a pattern, just to go over gauges even more. So here's the swatch for the wrist warmer pattern. It is 16 stitches wide and 8 rows of double crochet in the back loop. That is what makes the texture. I made this with the Bamboo U yarn, which is a size 4 yarn on the weight scale, and an H hook. So for the next class, whenever I make my other set of wrist warmers with you all, I'm out of this Bamboo U. I only bought one skein of it. So I needed to find something else in my stash that I could use. Plus these dark colors don't really show up well, so I needed a light color to crochet with you all. So I looked in my stash and I found another size 4 yarn, and it's the I Love This Wool. So this would be a good substitution option for you guys if you happen to need a substitution yarn. This is from Hobby Lobby. So this is a size 4 yarn. It seemed about the same thickness as the other yarn that I used. So here's an end. These are pretty close to each other. Here they are stretched out. They look to be about the same thickness. I like to stretch mine out because then you see how like close they are. Sometimes they look really thick when they're loose, and then once you tighten them up they get really thin. So I thought that this would be a really good substitution, so I made another swatch out of it. And guess what? It is a perfect match. So for this one, I just was able to lay it on top of my other swatch and see how it fits perfectly. So both of these are 4-inch swatches. If I take my ruler and measure them, they're both 4 inches. My ruler is going to hit the glare of the light. But they're 4-inch swatches. So I know that this is a good substitution of yarn. Now as I'm feeling it, this one doesn't feel stiffer. It feels a little bit loose compared to this one. So if you're wanting something super warm, this one is a little bit warmer than this one. But this one is 100% wool, so it might end up being more warm than this bamboo one. So I went ahead and in my same stash, I grabbed another size 4 yarn. This is the I Love This yarn acrylic, not the wool like this one was. And it's also a size 4 weight, and I used an H hook as well. So this one, I'm going to put it down first because it's a little bit bigger than these. And I'm going to measure it from the corner. So there's the corner. And see how it's just a little bit bigger? Like maybe a 1/4 of an inch bigger? That's why it's really important to do a gauge swatch, especially if you're trying to substitute a yarn, because see, this yarn's quite a bit bigger. And I mean, you can tell just by looking at it that this one's thicker than this one too. And so if I wanted to make this one, I would just have to know it's going to be a little bit bigger. But it's not so much bigger that I would probably need to change a hook, because I usually say to change a hook if the size is like a 1/2 inch bigger. And if I put this in the middle, I mean, you can barely tell that it's any bigger. You can only tell if it's from the corner. So that's like really not much of a big deal that it's that much bigger. So you could probably still use the same hook and everything and it would be fine with this one. But what if I was going to try to substitute an even bigger yarn? So I went through my stash and found a size 5 yarn, which is a bulkier yarn. And I made this swatch. So if I take this swatch with our original swatch, and I meet it up at the same corner, I also stitched this bigger swatch with the size H hook. These were all stitched on a size H hook. So this one is like way bigger. And if I tried to stitch this with a size smaller, which would be a size 7, because between G and H there's a 7. And then this fabric would be a little bit too stiff. And we'll talk more about drape after this video, but see how this is cushy and soft? The drape would be off if we used a smaller one. So this really wouldn't be a good substitute for our wrist warmers, whereas this acrylic or this wool would be, because all of these are size 4s, so they kind of work. There was a little bit of a difference, but nothing big enough to worry about. This one is so much bigger that I wouldn't even try to substitute it for this pattern just because it's way bigger. And this is using the same size hook. So that's how you can tell that like the gauge is completely off by trying to substitute with this bigger yarn. So I hope that's a good little visual for you guys with that substituting yarn. Using the same hook, substituting a different size yarn. So now I'm going to show you the swatches that I made. I ran out of the bamboo yarn, so I'm going to use this one from now on. This is the same 4-inch swatch that it calls for, 16 stitches and 8 rows in the pattern. And so I took different hook sizes to show you kind of what it would look like to use different size hooks with the same swatch. So I did the same stitches and the same rows on these, but I used different hooks. So this first one is a size bigger, so I used a size I hook for it. And then this is my size H hook. So I'm just going to meet those up on the same edges. And like with our acrylic that we used, it's just a tiny bit bigger. So if you felt that this one was a little too small, you could go up 1 hook and it wouldn't make that big of a difference. So this size right here is the next size down from an H hook, which is the 7. And if I meet that one up in the same corner, so I'm just going to stack these all up on top of each other, you can see that it's just a little bit smaller. So you can kind of see the edges down here at the bottom better than you can on the side because of my lighting. The shadows are better here. So this is our I hook, our H hook, and our 7 hook. And then this one I made with a G hook. It's so much tighter than the other ones, and this makes a really scratchy, stiff fabric because the stitches are so tight together. Again, with drape, often if your gauge is too tight, you'll have a tight drape up to the fabric. So as you can see, it just gradually gets smaller as we go down in hook size, which that's what you want. If you're having a big gaping issues between hook size, your tension is really not evened out yet, which as a beginner, your tension may not even out for a while, but if you did something like this, you would be able to see if your tension is pretty even, if it's going to be the same all the time. Now, I'm not saying I don't have a day where I'm really tense because, you know, work was rough and things at home aren't going right, and I'm just crocheting really tightly because I'm just frustrated. So pick a time when you're like completely calm and you're finding crochet easy to do, and try to do this exercise and see how your gauge swatches line up. If they're ever so slightly a difference between hook size, then you're doing really good. So let's talk about the gauge that, remember when we talked about looking at these yarn gauge swatches here, that you could make that swatch and see if your tension was correct for the hook. So this one called for a K hook, which I thought was really crazy because this is a pretty thin yarn. But once I did the single crochets and the rows, with the K hook even, it ended up measuring out right. So here was my swatch that I made with that one. And for some reason my chain row was much bigger than it should have been. I was chaining very loosely, I guess. So it's kind of bigger at this bottom, so I'm just going to measure like the up top area. But if I put my ruler over it, you can tell that it's 4 inches. So the gauge was correct. If I use a K hook with that yarn and do those stitches, I did get a 4-inch square. So you can always test your tension that way as well. And sometimes it might be off. And like I said, not everybody has perfect tension. I'm not even saying there is a perfect tension. Everyone does stuff their own way. You just want to make sure whichever pattern designer you're reading, that your tension matches up with theirs. So if you have to wiggle yours around to get it to work to fit their tension, that's cool. It's perfectly fine. I just want you guys to understand how gauge works and how one little difference can make a really big issue. Like this one. I only went up one weight in yarn and it changed my pattern by this much. Can you imagine if you made a sweater and you did it for this yarn and didn't even make a gauge swatch? That sweater would be way bigger than it was supposed to be. So it's just really important that you make these gauge swatches before you start doing your projects. And I hope that this really cleared up a lot of that.